What happens when a convenience store robbery goes tragically wrong and decades later sparks a nationwide debate about the death penalty? That's exactly what we'll explore as we examine the controversial execution of Richard Moore in South Carolina, a case where the lines between self-defense and murder became tragically blurred, and where calls for mercy came from the most unexpected places, including the very people who condemned him to death. In September 1999, on what began as an ordinary day in Spartanburg, South Carolina, a simple transaction at a convenience store would spiral into a deadly confrontation that would echo through the justice system for decades to come. Richard Moore, who was struggling with drug addiction at the time, walked into the store to make a purchase. He was 12 cents short. What happened next would become a matter of fierce debate in the courtrooms. The store clerk, James Mahoney, was known as a friendly face in the community, a man who had worked at the store for years and was well respected by customers and neighbors alike. The interaction between these two men quickly escalated from a dispute over pocket change into a fatal encounter. Moore, who entered the store unarmed, would end up in a desperate struggle with Mahoney, who had access to 2 firearms behind the counter. In the chaos that followed, both men would fire shots. Mahoney was struck in the chest, while Moore was hit in the arm. Only one would survive that day. These few violent moments would set in motion a legal battle spanning more than 2 decades, raising profound questions about self-defense, criminal intent, and the ultimate price of justice in our society. The trial that followed was marked by controversy from its very beginning, particularly in the composition of the jury. Despite Spartanburg County's population being 20% African American at the time, not a single black juror was selected to serve. This striking disparity would later become a crucial point in Moore's appeals and clemency petition. The prosecution painted a picture of a premeditated robbery gone wrong. They argued that Moore's initial intention was theft, pointing to the fact that he took approximately $1,400 from the register after the shooting. They emphasized that Moore's actions following the shooting, specifically taking the money, demonstrated his true criminal motives. But Moore's defense team presented a drastically different narrative. They argued that their client never intended to rob the store and entered completely unarmed. According to their account, the situation only turned violent after Mahoney pulled out a gun during an argument over 12 cents. Moore maintained that he acted in self-defense, wrestling the first gun away from Mahoney, only to find himself facing a second weapon. The defense would later argue that Moore's original attorneys failed to properly analyze the crime scene evidence or effectively challenge the prosecution's version of events. Critical details, like the positioning of the weapons and the trajectory of the bullets, they claimed, could have supported Moore's account of a defensive struggle rather than an attempted robbery. In the end, the jury was convinced by the prosecution's argument. They delivered a guilty verdict and recommended the death penalty, a decision that would later haunt at least 3 of the jurors who would eventually join the plea for clemency. What makes this case particularly unique is that Moore became the only person on South Carolina's death row who began their crime unarmed and, according to his defenders, with no initial intention to kill. What began as a death sentence transformed into a remarkable story of rehabilitation and redemption, sparking an unprecedented coalition of supporters seeking clemency for Richard Moore. 3 jurors from his original trial, the very people who had sentenced him to death, came forward to advocate for his life. In letters to Governor McMaster, they expressed their change of heart, citing Moore's extraordinary transformation during his time on death row. The trial judge himself joined this chorus of voices, along with John Osment, a former director of the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Osment's support was particularly telling. As someone who had overseen countless inmates during his tenure from 2003 to 2011, his advocacy spoke volumes about Moore's character and rehabilitation. Inside the prison walls, Moore had become a model inmate. Guards spoke of his role in maintaining peace among the prison population. He became a mentor to other inmates, helping them navigate their own paths toward rehabilitation. His faith became a cornerstone of his transformed life, with several pastors attesting to his genuine spiritual growth and positive influence on the prison community. Perhaps most poignantly, Moore's role as a father and grandfather demonstrated the depth of his rehabilitation. Despite the severe limitations of death row, he found ways to dote on his grandchildren and maintain strong relationships with his children. Through letters, visits, and phone calls, he worked to be present in their lives, offering guidance and love from behind prison walls. Moore's spotless prison record stood as tangible evidence of his transformation. For over 2 decades, he maintained exemplary behavior without a single disciplinary incident. This wasn't just about following rules, it was about actively contributing to a better prison environment, helping others, and demonstrating genuine remorse for his actions. The breadth of support for Moore's clemency petition was unprecedented. From legal professionals to religious leaders, from corrections officials to his own jury members, they all pointed to a fundamental question. If the death penalty is meant for the worst of the worst, how could it be justified for someone who had so clearly demonstrated the capacity for change and positive impact, even from within prison walls? As the final hours of Richard Moore's life approached, the gravity of what was about to unfold weighed heavily on everyone present at the South Carolina execution facility. At 6:01 p.m., the curtain to the death chamber was drawn open, a departure from previous executions where witnesses arrived to find it closed. Moore lay there, his eyes shut, face turned upward toward the ceiling, perhaps in his final moments of reflection. His last meal was a carefully chosen selection: a medium-cooked steak, fried catfish and shrimp, scalloped potatoes, green peas, and broccoli with cheese. For dessert, he had sweet potato pie and German chocolate cake, washing it all down with grape juice. These final tastes of life were savored knowing they would be his last. Through his attorney of 10 years, Lindsey Vann, Moore shared his final words. He expressed deep remorse to the Mahoney family for their pain and loss. To his children and granddaughters, he spoke with pride and love, thanking them for bringing joy to his life. He acknowledged his family and friends, both old and new, expressing gratitude for their support throughout his journey. The execution process itself was clinical and methodical. After the announcement at 6:01 p.m., Moore took several deep breaths that witnesses described as sounding like snores. These were followed by shallow breaths until approximately 6:04 p.m. when his breathing ceased altogether. Throughout the procedure, he showed no visible signs of distress. In the chamber, the emotional weight was palpable. Vann clutched a prayer bracelet with a cross, tears falling as the execution commenced. Beside her sat a spiritual advisor, hands resting on his knees with palms turned upward in silent prayer. 2 members of the victim's family maintained stoic composure, as did solicitor Barry Barnett, who had helped secure Moore's conviction years ago. At 6:24 p.m., Richard Moore was pronounced dead, marking the end of a life that had become, according to many, a testament to rehabilitation and redemption. His death left behind grieving children who lost their father and grandchildren who would grow up without their papa, creating what his lawyers described as a new set of victims in this complex tragedy of justice and mercy. Moore's execution raises troubling questions about the consistency and fairness of South Carolina's death penalty system. Consider this stark contrast. Todd Colehep, who killed 7 people and tortured one of his victims for days, received a life sentence, while Moore, who entered a store unarmed with no initial intention to kill, was put to death. This disparity forces us to examine what truly constitutes a death penalty-worthy crime in our justice system. The racial dynamics of Moore's case cannot be ignored. In a county where 20% of residents are black, Moore, an African-American man, faced an all-white jury. This demographic imbalance reflects a broader pattern in capital cases, where racial composition of juries often skews against defendants of color. South Carolina has now carried out 45 executions since the reinstatement of capital punishment, with 4 more inmates scheduled for execution in the coming months. Of the 30 people currently on death row, Moore's case stood out as unique. He was the only one whose crime began without a weapon or premeditated intent to kill. The state's approach to clemency also deserves scrutiny. Despite unprecedented support for mercy from jurors, the trial judge, and even a former prison director, the governor maintained the historical pattern. No South Carolina governor has ever granted clemency in a death penalty case. This raises questions about whether clemency serves its intended purpose as a final safeguard against miscarriage of justice. What does it say about our justice system when rehabilitation, good behavior, and broad support for mercy carry so little weight against the machinery of capital punishment? And how do we reconcile these inconsistencies in sentencing, where similar or even more severe crimes result in vastly different punishments? As we close today's episode of The Real Crime Diary, I want you to consider a fundamental question. Is justice truly served when we execute a reformed individual while others who committed more heinous crimes serve life sentences? Richard Moore's case isn't just about one man's fate. It's about the very foundations of our capital punishment system. What does it mean when jurors who originally voted for death later plead for the defendant's life? When a trial judge joins the chorus calling for mercy? When even those who've run our prison systems say this execution wasn't justified? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They're at the heart of how we define justice in America.